Panther Wakanda Forever is one of the most anticipated movies of 2022, and now that it's actually out, let's give it a review. The main question this video is trying to answer is simple. Did Black Panther Wakanda Forever live up to the expectations set forth by its predecessor? The way that we are going to answer that is in two very specific ways. In order to holistically review the entire movie, we are going to have a spoiler-free section at the beginning and a spoiler section at the end. Starting off, there is no better way to begin our journey than to talk about the directing and the writing for this project. Everybody knows director Ryan Coogler coming back had a tall task ahead. By the time that they were about to start filming Black Panther Wakanda Forever, he already had a script going. A fully completed script for one of the most anticipated sequels in the entirety of the MCU. And then, of course, out of nowhere, in a news that shook the entire world, it was announced that Chadwick Boseman had unfortunately passed to colon cancer. So now, this project not only had to live up to the expectations that the first one set forth, but it also had to serve as a sort of memorial to celebrate the life and legacy of Chadwick Boseman. Was this movie successful in doing that? Absolutely yes. When it comes to the story for this installment, Ryan Coogler did a superb job at obviously setting forth the future of Wakanda as a whole, setting up what we know is going to be the new Black Panther, and of course, doing justice and providing enough of a cathartic goodbye to Chadwick Boseman's legacy in the MCU. When it comes to the directorial style, I knew what I was expecting because I was a big fan of Creed and, of course, the first Black Panther movie, with grounded themes and motifs that were impactful to multiple communities and, of course, a proper send-off for Chadwick's Black Panther. So, of course, I am proud to let you know that from the directorial and writing standpoint, everything in here was top-notch. I would say that the biggest win this movie has is that the cinematography accentuates every single part of the story. One of the biggest improvements in this installment over the previous one is, of course, the camera work, the lighting, the use of color, and of course, the action set pieces. Keep in mind, this installment shows us a lot more of Wakanda and introduces us to an underwater nation known as Talocan. The vibrant color schemes and the production and set design made both of these locations stand out beautifully. We had already seen parts of Wakanda in the previous movie and, of course, during the Infinity War saga. But this felt a lot more personal, especially during the funeral scenes that we saw during the trailer. I'm telling you, there are some visual moments in this movie that are gonna make you cry. I cried 7 times all throughout. I was mostly interested in the biggest question when it came to the cinematography. How were they going to differentiate the nation of Talocan to the comics version of Atlantis? Needless to say, it is absolutely beautiful. With that being said, most of that effect is done through some well thought out costume design, but the underwater structures and the descriptions of previous versions of the Talocan people truly stood out in a way that made this change to be more centered around Mayan and Aztec architecture truly makes sense. Now that we've covered the visuals, the directing, and the writing, let's talk about the story. This is a full thematical exploration of grief and loss. Both for the audience and the characters, we are dealing with the loss of a really important figure in this entire franchise. So how would his family, his enemies, and the rest of the world react to his passing? Every single aspect of this conundrum is covered in a respectful way. Spend time exploring what this character meant to every single individual from his family, and by extension, the rest of Wakanda. We couldn't talk about the story without also covering the Herculean efforts that we got on the acting side. This was a stacked cast through and through, where we had seasoned veterans returning from the very first project who had the task of moving the story forward. Letitia Wright, Angela Bassett, Winston Duke, Danai Gurira, Martin Freeman, everybody brought their A game. And of course, we can't forget Lupita Nyong'o. Although they had more of a secondary role, Michaela Cole and Mabel Cadena are added to the star-studded cast, including, of course, Dominique Thorne making her entrance as Riri Williams, aka Ironheart. But if you've seen any other major reviews by now, you know that the 3 people that carried this project on their backs were Tenoch Huerta, Angela Bassett, and Letitia Wright. Before we get to the titular characters, let's talk about the villain, Namor. Tenoch Huerta wasn't a huge household name before this movie. He is going to now. I knew him through his work in Narcos, and I knew that he was going to be a great anti-hero for this specific project. And the way that they handled his background and, of course, his ideological struggles with Letitia Wright's character was an absolute masterpiece. He is the soul of this film when it comes to moving the conflict forward. Both Wakanda and Talocan have suffered immensely for multitudes of reasons. In Namor's case, he has seen his people struggle for a long-ass time and will do anything in his powers to stop the surface world from interfering in Talocan's affairs. We'll cover a little bit more of the story elements once we get to the spoiler section, but we should know his presence in this film is felt all throughout. And of course, that leads us to Dominique Thorne and Angela Bassett. Queen Ramonda's performance is gut-wrenching and visceral throughout every single moment that she is on screen. It's an intense, thoughtful, and passionate performance from a woman who now has lost everything both as a mother and as a queen. I can also echo those sentiments when it comes to Letitia Wright's performance as Shuri. She has to carry a monumental burden both personally and emotionally, while also trying to live up to the legacy that her brother once kept. Truthfully, it is an amazing character study on both ends on how you are able to deal with grief, process it, and how it affects you moving forward. Truthfully, it is a brilliant character study of how grief and loss affects you both as a person and professionally, and also, on top of that, how you are able to move forward. Dominique Thorne delivers a solid performance as Ironheart, but I'll get more into that in the spoiler section. The big one that stood out to me on the side character side is, of course, besides Namor, Danai Gurira as Okoye. She has some pretty big shoes to fill as the leader of the army. Her relationship to Queen Ramonda and Shuri is explored beautifully here as well. There are some captivating and riveting moments where Queen Ramonda and Okoye discuss everything that has happened in the past of Wakanda that left me completely shook. So, after discussing the writing, the directing, the cinematography, the acting, and how they accentuate the rest of the story, are there any negatives? And I have to say, yes. Listen, not every movie is perfect, and that is part of my point. Movies can be great and flawed at the exact same time. While I won't go into too much detail into spoiler territory until later in the video, you should know that this movie has some emotional moments that kind of fall by the wayside. Keep in mind, we have over 2 hours and 30 minutes of runtime, which is a lot to explore. But there are some emotional moments that would have benefited from a different approach on how to execute them, or a little bit more time to fully flesh them out. Besides that, on the technical side, there aren't too many hiccups along the way. Yes, there is one specific action scene where the CGI obviously has to be used a lot since we're dealing with water scenes, but thankfully, it wasn't that much of a big deal. To me, the only real issues came when we tried to rush through an emotional scene or leave out a little bit of important pieces of context that would make those moments hit a ton harder. With that being said, it is time to answer the question: did this movie live up to the height of its predecessor? The answer is yes. Thematically, visually, tonally, this was a breathtaking exploration of a conflict between Wakanda and Talokan that extends way beyond the silver screen. It is an ideological powerhouse dealing with the themes of loss, grief, and the responsibility of overcoming it for the sake of yourself and the people that surround you. Everybody pulled their own weight on the acting side, and thankfully, this was a self-contained story. There was no need to explore the broader impact on the MCU, especially now that we're dealing with the multiverse. This is specifically a Wakandan and Talokan story. I'm gonna give you my full rating at the end of the video, but now it is time to talk about spoilers. So again, if you haven't seen the movie, make sure to like the video, subscribe if you're new, and of course, let's get on with the show. So, what are the big emotional moments that didn't sit particularly right with me? One of them, which I thought was pretty glaring, was the way that they handled Queen Ramonda's death. After enrolling in some psychological warfare with Namor in terms of how to handle the intrusion of the surface world in Wakanda and Talokan as a whole, everything comes into a boiling point. Remember, we know by the trailers of the film that the UN and certain countries within that organization were overtly trying to go into Wakanda in order to steal vibranium, since it's one of the most valuable resources on Earth. This unfortunately leads into some mining rigs coming into close contact with vibranium reserves in the bottom of the ocean, aka Talokan. At this point, Namor has made this society a secretive nation, filled with intense biodiversity and of course a rich cultural heritage, but they are still isolationist, just like Wakanda. This of course leads to a breaking point where Namor has decided that it is his job to fight the surface world in order to protect his people. And Wakanda, which have one of the most powerful nations on Earth in terms of resources and technology, cannot let that happen. Shuri, who is now the new Black Panther, needs to make a decision: support Talokan or go against it. We have some beautiful scenes during Shuri's kidnapping where she is able to directly connect to the people of Talokan. And while she is able to appreciate the cultural history and the context of their decisions, she cannot sit idly by as the people of Talokan unalive Riri Williams for having the technical know-how to create a machine that can identify vibranium and of course lead the surface world into Talokan. So this setup leads to an inevitable confrontation between Wakanda and Talokan, and the biggest casualty is of course Queen Ramonda. Talokan's invasion of Wakanda was a cinematic masterpiece. The usage of water grenades and super slow-mo action set pieces as the infantry is a perfect example of how an action set piece can truly accentuate the story and question your moral compass. Namor wants to protect his people, and he is willing to unalive the entire Wakandan royalty in order to do so. That is where we see Queen Ramonda's motherly instincts kick in and try to protect Shuri and Riri Williams in order for them to survive. Unfortunately, this leads to an unceremonious drowning which hits us really hard at a pivotal moment in the movie. However, unlike the ceremony that we had for Chadwick's passing, this felt like an abrupt story decision that should have been explored a little bit further. I'm gonna have to watch the movie again to fully grasp all of the details, but it truthfully appeared that from the time that Ramonda makes her final decisions to the time that Shuri has in order to grieve her at the funeral, it's less than 2 minutes that pass. There truly is no time to grasp the consequences and the gravity of this decision. Now I get it. I understand why they did it. This is meant to accentuate the Killmonger reveal. What exactly is that? Well, in the moment that Shuri decides to become the Black Panther, she goes to the ancestral plane. What exactly is that? Well, in the moment that Shuri actually decides to become the Black Panther and is supposed to go to the ancestral plane, the reality is that she does not believe in the ancestral plane and ends up meeting Eric Killmonger, who is the closest relative that understands the ideological conundrum that she is in. It is ultimately a decision that she has to make for herself, to be altruistic and noble like her brother, or be vengeful and effective at neutralizing a threat like Eric Killmonger, her cousin. This moment, Ramonda's death, is the catalyst that sets Shuri on the vengeful path that her brother once took. And although she does end up changing her mind at the end of the film, which we will discuss later, it ultimately undermines the gravity of Ramonda's sacrifice in order to accentuate an ideological conundrum. Again, this moment could have sat well with you, but it didn't sit well with me, and that's the beauty of media. We can experience it in different ways and acknowledge what they are trying to do. Just to reiterate, in case it didn't land, Papa, I am not saying that the decision to kill Ramonda was wrong. I'm saying that the way and the style in which they come across that decision could have been handled differently. The other moment that didn't sit right with me is, of course, at the end of the movie. Now that Shuri is the Black Panther and she rallies everybody almost by force in Wakanda to make sure that they support her efforts to fight Talocan directly, we have a final battle scene at sea that decides the winner of the conflict. The final fight between Namor and Shuri leads to a less than stellar conclusion. The actual fight itself is fine. Shuri is able to outsmart Namor and force him to yield. Although she would like nothing else than to have revenge for the passing of her mother and, of course, use this as a coping mechanism for dealing with her brother's death, she understands that unaliving Namor would lead to an eternal war with Talocan, and she has already had direct experience talking and interacting with these people and know that they are not evil. They are just trying to protect themselves. However, there is a small scene that really just didn't sit right with me. Almost 30 seconds after Namor absolutely admits defeat and yields, both Shuri and Namor travel via helicopter to the area of the battle in order to let both sides know, hey, we are not fighting anymore, this is a ceasefire. Both of them travel together in the helicopter to the battle site and essentially just say, okay, Talocan, the battle is done. But then in the subsequent scene, we learn that Wakanda and Talocan are actually working together now, almost like barely 5 minutes after having the biggest conflict in both of their histories. Again, it's not a matter of having a story decision. Obviously, you have to move the plot forward and establish whether Namor is going to be an anti-hero or an actual villain. How they went from A to B without that added layer of context that would make the moment hit a lot harder. Overall, those were the only 2 moments that truthfully didn't sit right with me, but everything else, especially the post-credit scene ending, made this project a worthwhile experience. So, after going through the non-spoiler and spoiler moments, how do we describe this movie? To me, it is a powerful, visceral, emotional exploration of grief, loss, and of course, personal reflection in dealing with the loss of a loved one and handling their legacy and responsibility moving forward. It was touching, intense, visually masterful, and I think it lands as one of the biggest and best projects of Marvel's solo movies. Especially in Phase 4, which can only be described as a roller coaster of emotions, this is literally in the top 3. Without any further ado, I think this movie deserves a solid A. It wasn't perfect. There were some emotional moments that fell a bit under the bridge because of the pacing and some of the story decisions that were surrounding it when it comes to context. But it was a sensational memorial to Chadwick Boseman's legacy, and it sets up Wakanda's future perfectly moving forward. It's made over $330 million since opening weekend, and I expect it to be going closer to $1 billion by the time that it's all said and done. Gripping, emotional, and an action-packed extravaganza that kept me entertained the entire way through. It has the Tropical Joe seal of approval. With that being said, let me know what you thought about the movie in the comments down below. And of course, if you enjoyed the review, make sure to like the video and subscribe if you're new, because we are going to be covering Black Panther's impact on the MCU as a whole very, very soon. Just as I do with movies and everything pop culture in this channel, you should know I also have a gaming channel called Tropical Joe Gaming, where I cover gameplays, reviews, and commentary on all things gaming. So if you want to subscribe over there, I'm gonna be right there to cover all the gaming stuff. With that said, familia, that is all it from me. So as always, remember to crack a smile, just ride the wave, and I'll see you on the next one.